So today, being that it's Bay's Iyar, I decided to bring a little bit, and tomorrow we'll start the Tanya, the Kunter Sacher in Mitzvah Shem. So the Rebbe Maharash was born in 1833 on Bay's Iyar, and he passed away in 1882. So in the English, it would be 49 years, but in the Hebrew years, it's 50 years because it was after the new year already. Anyway, so he had a short life. The most misunderstood Chabad Rebbe is the fourth Rebbe, Reb Shmuel. And I'll explain to you why. So he's the fourth of the seven Lubavitcher Rebbes. He had six other brothers, five of which survived. One of them passed away in his teenage years. His name was Yankel. He was a son of the Tzemach Tzedek. But the Tzemach Tzedek had seven boys and two or three girls. I don't remember if it was three. Could be it was three daughters. Two or three. So he had a large family, the Tzemach Tzedek. Now, during the period of the Tzemach Tzedek, things in Russia were relatively quiet. Now, what do I mean quiet? I'm referring to the economy. I'm referring to wars, and then I'm referring to the dispute that preceded the Tzemach Tzedek between the Chassidim and the Mesnagdim. And something very interesting happened during the life of the Tzemach Tzedek, where he and the grandson and the son of Reb Chaim of Volozhin, known as Reb Yitzchak of Volozhin, Reb Itchele, they called him Itchele Volozhner, worked hand in hand. And in 1843, when there was a conference in Petersburg to stop certain edicts against the Frum community, not the Jewish community, but the Frum community, the Rebbe of Volozhin and the Tzemach Tzedek went together to the conference. This summer, when I was researching at the archives in Cincinnati, I came across an interesting book, and in this book, that was written by Dr. Max Lilienthal. I don't know if that name means anything to you, but Max Lilienthal was from either Lithuania or Russia. He was Orthodox, and he came to New York, I think in 1850, and then in 1855 to Cincinnati. He is credited, if you call it a credit, as one of the people who started and developed the reform movement in America, Max Lilienthal. This Max Lilienthal was from in Russia, but his orientation was with Haskalah, enlightenment. And he went to Lubavitch. It's very interesting. And he writes up what he saw in Lubavitch, I think in the 1840s. In other words, he was a bridge for the Russian government to convince the Tzemach Tzedek and Reb Itchele of Volozhin that they should concede with the edicts that the Haskalah wanted. So he writes about his experience with the Tzemach Tzedek and his experience with Reb Itchele of Volozhin, and it's very interesting. I never read it before. I read it this summer, and I put it into one of my new books that's coming out. What I found I actually copied the pages because the words speak for themselves. It's you're talking about someone who's giving you live testimony from 175 years ago. That's amazing, because most things are hearsay. Here he says, I was there, I went there. Okay, it's his impressions. And by the way, he writes with great respect about the Tzemach Tzedek. And he implies that he won't be able to convince him. But Rebbe Itzchel of Lozhener, who was a Litvisher, he says, okay, and this, he says that he got him to agree to allowing secular studies as a requirement for the rabbinate in Russia. That was one of the points of contention. Thus, a rabbi, to become a rabbi in a Russian community, of a shul, etc., of a community, must you have a degree? Must you know Russian? Must you write Russian? Now, we have the same thing repeated, by the way, in 1910, when the Rebbe Rashab went with Reb Chaim of Brisk to another conference, also to fight the same thing. But already almost 100 years, 70 years before, the same argument, existed then. So I'm just saying, what I want to say is that the Tzemach Tzedek and the Reb Chaim and Rebbe Itzchel of Lozhen, although two different backgrounds, they bonded. Again, I'm not saying they agreed on everything, but overall they were in the same page. And whether Rebbe Itzchel did indeed consent to, having rabbis be required to know Russian, write Russian, and all of that, it could be yes, it could be no. That's what I would say. I wouldn't be surprised if it's yes. I wouldn't be surprised if it's no. But there were other issues. Now, why? So here during the time of the Alter Rebbe, Baal Shem Tov, Magid, Alter Rebbe, Mittler Rebbe, and all the Hasidic Rebbes of other groups at the time, it was big machlokes. I don't have to tell you, it was very big machlokes, disagreements between Chassidim and Misnagdim. It was not pretty. Okay, and it's been documented that we have letters. It's not someone made up a story. We have the letters, going back, how they were fighting. Okay, it was not nice. Anyway, so how is it that all of a sudden with the Tzemach Tzedek it ended? And the explanation is very simple. The Tzemach Tzedek was also a goin in Nigla, in halacha. He was a great halachist. And the time was right that opened up and brought in many non-Hasidim to the Tzemach Tzedek. Maybe not as full-fledged Hasidim, but to definitely tolerate Chassidus and more. And many became Hasidim. Now, you'll ask me a question. Well, the Alter Rebbe wrote the Shulchan Aruch, as yesterday Moshe made a good point. We spoke about it yesterday. But that time, Moshe, it was still raw. It was very raw, the Alter Rebbe's time. The machlokes was in full force, right? As the years went on and kind of, the Misnagdim, saw they couldn't get their way, and then the Chassidim separated themselves from Misnagdim, like not davening in their shuls. You know what I'm saying? So it calmed it down compared to the Alter Rebbe's time. So during the Tzemach Tzedek's time, when he came along, and his name, he was known throughout Russia as one of the greatest halachas and codifiers, and especially with agunos. Now the story with the Cantonist, where they drafted the children into the army for 25 years, and Rahman al-Islam, they became Christians, they became Greek Orthodox, Russians, and all of that. Tzemach Tzedek fought heavily against this. And there is a Chabadnik who's a big supporter of not just Chabad, you've heard his name, Levi Levayev, right? Mr. Levayev, I think he lives in London, or if he didn't move back, a wealthy man in the jewelry business, in the diamond business. He told over at one of the Kinnis HaShluchims in public, it's online, that his family comes from the Kantonisten. I think it was him or Dr. From Albany, New York, someone else. One of these people who doesn't have a beard, you wouldn't think he's a Chabadnik, and he says, we come from the Tzemach Tzedek saved our grandfather. Yeah, I think it was Levayev. And sent shluchim and made them stay from and all that. So the Tzemach Tzedek's name, his halachic impact, made a big impact in the Russian Jewish community at large. And because the flames of fire of the machlekes were calming down, it was the right timing. So they say that he had 100,000 chassidim between Ukraine and Russia. Now it's very hard to imagine, but when I got the Sefer Ha'och, which is a children's magazine that came out from the year 1911 to 1915 in Lubavitch, to excite children about wanting to learn in a yeshiva, and in this case, Lubavitch Yeshiva in Russia. You take a look at the index that they put out in the new volume. You see probably 10,000 names, and most of those names are not. We don't know who they are. They're not Lubavitcher names. So what happened to them? We don't know. But what it showed me is that if in 1911 to 1915, there's like 10,000 names that are somehow associated, right? Somehow. So go back 180 years before that, in 1840 and 1850, 1830, 1840, 50, with the Tzemach Tzedek's time, it doesn't surprise me that there could have been 100,000 Hasidim. This morning, someone had Yard site today in Shul, and standing next to me was someone who was a very learned person. He learned in Chaim Berlin, and he's the Balkore, many minyonim. So I told the Bal Yard site that your father's Yard site is on today, which is the Rebbe Maharash's Yom Haledes, Tiferet shb'Tiferes, Beis Iyar. And then I said, and he was standing next to me, this Litvisher, and I said to him, and Chevra, you should know that his great-grandparents were Lubavitcher Chassidim, because he told me that. He told me that. And he didn't deny it. He says, don't say the secret. And there were many that today are Litvisher that came from Gezer Lubavitch. And let me let you in on the secret. Rabbi Aaron Kotler, the head of Lakewood, came from Lubavitcher Gezer. And the proof is that his son's name is Reb Shneir Kotler, was Reb Shneir Kotler. Reb Shneir Kotler was really going to be named Shneir Zalman after the Alter Rebbe. And I think, yeah, but the problem is the Reb Aaron's father-in-law, Reb Brisser Zalman Meltzer, was still alive. One of the Rosh Hashivas of Eitz Chaim on the Rehov Yafa, before they knocked it down and put up hotels and buildings, right? That famous building, Rehov Yafa. Eitz Chaim, the famous yeshiva, Reb Brisser Zalman was, right? So his name was Zalman, and he was the father of Reb Aaron Kotler. Reb Aaron Kotler had a baby, so he couldn't name him Shneir Zalman, so he named him Shneir Kotler. And I heard this also not from a Chabadnik. I heard this from Shneir Lehman, Professor Shneir Lehman, who told me that Shneir Kotler told him this at a wedding. You'll never hear this from someone in Lakewood. First of all, most of them don't know. The young generation doesn't even know this. And the ones that still maybe know, it's like we come from the Balatanya. So I'm just showing you, well, Hillel, you've shared how, the Tzeitlin name goes back to Chassidim, Lubavitch Chassidim, maybe in middle they went to another Rebbe and another this, but it is associated way back with Chabad Chassidim. So you had a lot of this. You had a lot of this in the 1800s. So the fact that today we don't have it, it's not. So what happened? So I told them this morning what I believe happened is that the children and grandchildren of people in the 1800s, there was no Lubavitch yeshiva at the time. So they went to the Vlozhna yeshiva and they became Litvuks. You're 13, 14, 15, 16, you start davening in Nusach. I'm saying, Ashkenaz, it wasn't like today everyone is stuck to their party. You know what I'm saying? What, Moshe?
I was going to say, I've met many people who, you see them and they're they like guys in shul, they wear a short jacket, trim beard, right?
Yeah.
But maybe they wear a gartel, like a small gartel or something. In other words, and they start speaking to them, and they say, yeah, my parents or my grandparents are Hasidish, but my parents put us through Litvish yeshivas because they didn't, and now they're basically
right, and here in Brooklyn, the big yeshiva was Torah Vodas, Torah Vodas in Chaim Berlin, which you have in your shul, many people from those yeshivas, or even though they came from Chaim Berlin was, even though Rabbi Hutner was a quasi chassid, but it was a Litvish yeshiva. That was and Torah Vodas, even though Rabbi Shraga Feivel Mendelovich didn't say made the yeshiva not say Tachna Yutis Kislev, but it was also most of the Rebbes, Rabbi Yankel Kamenetsky and Rabbi Gedalia. You know what I'm saying? They were on the Litvish spectrum. Not misnagdim, but so automatically now it's fashionable for many of them, like you say, they put on the gartel, and the grandkids are starting to grow beards. It's a whole different format.
No, I'm saying the opposite. I'm saying that maybe you have that, but I'm saying their kids now, let's say they're my age. So maybe so we're gartel, but the kids are all in Litvish.
Well, okay. Well, again, and the answer is depending on what yeshiva you go to. At the end of the day, it depends on what yeshiva you go to. So during the time of the Hillel, during the time of the Tzemach Tzedek, there was no Lubavitch yeshiva. There were very few Chassidish yeshivas in Russia, right? I'm not talking about in Galicia, right? In Russia, there wasn't. So they and if there was, it was very small. So the big yeshiva was Vlozhin. It lasted from early 1802, I think, to 1892, or 1812 to 1892. Most of the 1800s was Vlozhin. Vlozhin had the greatest goinim, the Netziv, and Reb Chaim, and fine, but it was a Litvish yeshiva. Now you had the same thing later in the 1900s in Telz. In Europe, tells, and the previous Rebbe, we have to talk about the Maharash, but just for the record, the previous Rebbe sent a few of his Hasidim to to Telz, to Mir, to the Litvish yeshivas, not to make them Hasidim. People make a mistake. He wasn't looking to, he wanted the Hasidische the Bocherim who came from Hasidische homes to remain Hasidim. And they took off their long rekel, and they started to shear their beards, as it was Slabotka, and Tells, no one had a beard. That was the objective. And he said, you guys come from Hasidische homes, you're Gerer, you're this, you're that. You can learn a Litvish yeshiva, but why give away a custom? That's what bothered him, and that's what he tried doing. Hillel, what do you want to say?
I just was curious. In Eretz Yisrael, it seems to me that all of the major yeshivas in America, Davin Nusach Ashkenaz is the is the nusach of the yeshiva. Is that true in Eretz Yisrael as well?
Well, it depends if it's not a Chassidish yeshiva, of course. But if it's a Chassidish yeshiva, it's Sfard. But in Eretz Yisrael, in Eretz Yisrael you haven't taught what?
None of the major yeshivas and the major Litvish yeshivas daven nusach Sfard, which is sort of more normative here than it is in North America, it seems.
And I'll tell you something. You know, I was in Yerushalayim, Yom Tov, and I went into the Erloi Hasidim. They're out in Katamon, you know, Erloi.
Yeah.
They're the only Hasidic group that davens Ashkenaz, because they come from the Chassam Sofer. And they're Chassidim, which is just very interesting. Okay, let me go back to the Rebbe Maharash. So during the 1800s, we had relatively calm, but the Chassidim is Nagdim. Tzemach Tzedek has 7 kids. Tzemach Tzedek passes away in 1866, but already in the 1861, he doesn't feel well. What he had exactly is debatable, but his wife passed away then, and it seems like he went into either some kind of depression or he wasn't feeling well, and he stopped saying Maimorim by heart. And when he would come out and say a Maimor, he would say it from Aksav. He would read it. This is substantiated by the new book, the Shochet, that I've told you about, Pinya Goldenstein, who came finally to Eretz Yisrael and lived in Petach Tikva. And he was by the Tzemach Tzedek in 1864. You hear this? And he saw the way that Tzemach Tzedek goes onto the bima in Lubavitch. And he's surrounded by his sons, and he's reading from Aksav, which was unusual when a Lubavitcher Rebbe said Chassidus, like our Rebbe. He never used a text, but he wasn't well. So that's what he did. So already years, like before 1860, I would say about 10 years before, he had his surviving children who were willing to go to different communities around Lubavitch and to kind of be a semi-Rebbe for them, because travel was very hard. And they went, and they taught Chassidus, and meanwhile they accepted pidyonos, and people gave money with the pidyon, and that was something that they brought back to the Tzemach Tzedek, and the Tzemach Tzedek divided amongst his children. That was the general pattern. 2 of his children, Baruch, didn't agree to this. They didn't want to travel and be seen as a mini Rebbe. Which 2? The oldest, Reb Baruch Shalom, which our Rebbe comes from, and the youngest, Reb Shmuel, the Rebbe Maharash, the 4th Rebbe. So the oldest and the youngest said to their father, "Thank you, Father, for the opportunity, but we don't want to do that, for whatever reason." But all the other 4, right? The other 4 sons, the Nyezhner, the Liadir, etc., those sons did that. And that is why, after the passing of the Tzemach Tzedek, each one moved out to the place in which they had already set up shop and had Balabatim during the lifetime of the Tzemach Tzedek. So that's why in Ladi there was a Rebbe, in Yezhin there was a Rebbe, because the sons already were scouting those area for the father, and they had already a group of people who were interested in them. Yes, Hillel.
Is Kapost one of those?
Yes. But with Kapust, Kopust, that requires an entire discussion, because the father, the Mariel, Reb Yehuda Leib, he was the second son, but he passed away shortly after Tzemach Tzedek. The Tzemach Tzedek left a will, and in the will he says that he wants the Mariel and Reb Shmuel, the youngest, to remain in Lubavitch. And he speaks about that giving the house, dividing an apartment for each. What happened is that the Lubavitcher Hasidim detected, not in the Mariel, but in the son, who was referred to as the Kopister, Reb Shlomo Zalman Schneerson of Kopust, who wrote the Sefer Mogen Ovis, which is Hasidus. He understood and realized that the Tzemach Tzedek has a special liking to the youngest son and is going to want him to be his successor. And he did not want that. So initially he said, my father is older, and outwardly he's a greater tzaddik. So why should I wait? After the death of my grandfather, where there'll be machlekes, I'll set up shop quietly during my grandfather's lifetime. So by the time he passes on later, I'll have an entire, area with Hasidim, with money and everything else. And that's what happened. And when the Lubavitcher Hasidim found out about this, they were very upset. Very upset. Unfortunately, the Mariel, the son of the Tzemach Tzedek, passed away 3-4 months after his father. He wasn't in Lubavitch before because the Hasidim, the Lubavitcher, got wind of this setup before the Tzemach Tzedek passed away. And there became a very big machlekes between Lubavitcher Hasidim and Kopust Hasidim, or Chabad Hasidim, right? So it was so bad that the base Rebbe, who records what I'm telling you, he says that the Mariel, there was Eish Mislach Kachas, that's his language, a burning fire. There was tremendous, machlekes. And he didn't want to be part of it. He was really a tzaddik that was separated from the world. So he ran away to his son in Kopust. That's what happened. You hear that? His son had set himself up in a city called Kopust near Lubavitch. So the father, who was instructed by the Tzemach Tzedek to stay in Lubavitch, couldn't stay because he didn't want to be part of the machlekes. Unfortunately, 3 months later, he passed away. Of course, Hasidim, Lubavitcher Hasidim say it's because he didn't listen to his father, and no one will ever know, but that's a fact. That he did pass away 3 months after in Kopust because so who was left in Lubavitch? The Maharash. So you would think that the Maharash would have scot-free. Not so simple, Moshe. Not so simple. Why not? The other brothers took him to a din Torah. They said, just because our father left you and the older brother a house and said that you should live there, doesn't mean that you're the Lubavitcher Rebbe, that you're the successor of the Tzemach Tzedek. No. And they had a din Torah with Reb Shneir Zalman Fratkin, known as the Baal Torah's Chesed, who moved to Yerushalayim, and I took video of his house on Pri Chodesh Street in outside of Mea Shorim. It's now being built, but that they say is where he lived. He passed away in 1892, and he was a Goin. He was one of the Rabbanim. Reb David Tzvichein, known as the Radatz, also came to Yerushalayim, passed away 6 months after he came in 1925, and a third Rav. And they paskened, and especially the Teres Chesed, that the Rebbe Maharash should be the Lubavitcher Rebbe. You all, he said, are Chabad Rebbes in your communities, no problem. But the successor to the Tzemach Tzedek in Lubavitch is the youngest son. And this was a novelty. And I think today, you ever know, and Moshe told me, I think that one of the Reb Shapiro's sons is related to the Sadigur over there. And the Sadigur Rebbe, who passed away a few years ago, he surprised everyone and he left his youngest son as the Rebbe. And it's caused and causes a big rift in the community. You all know that, right? So this is in a similar way, this was the case. And when we understand it, you're the youngest. and you're not known to be as holy as maybe some of the others outwardly. So the question is, if he's the youngest and he's not outwardly known as the holiest, so Taka, why did they paskin this way? So there was testimony given by, I said this before, but I'm just testimony given by Reb Shmuel Ber of Borisov, and he was a big chassid at Tzemach Tzedek. And once the Tzemach Tzedek said a Maimach Chassidus, and people didn't understand Pshat, so including Reb Shmuel Ber, and he went to each of the brothers to ask him Pshat in their father's Maimer. They couldn't answer. He decided he's going to the Maharash, thinking, he definitely won't be able to answer. He's the youngest, He comes to the window and he sees through the window that he's learning the exact mimer, the exact page, implying that he knows, he's going to know it. He comes in and all of a sudden the Maharash is reading a newspaper, a Russian newspaper, to hide. And he says, why are you coming to me? You go to my brothers. They know Chassidus. I'm just a regular. He says, I caught you, Rebbe. I saw what you did. If you don't answer me my question, I'm going to tell everyone what I saw. And he told him Pshat in the Maimer. And he repeated this to the Bezdin. And he said, from this I know. And then there's another story with a dream he had, but from this I know that he should be the Lubavitcher Rebbe. He should be the successor. Another point, when our Rebbe published on behalf of the Friedrich Rebbe in 1947, told us the history of the Rebbe Maharash, that was the first of any of the Lubavitcher Rebbes told us that was printed, not the Alter Rebbe, not the Mittler Rebbe, the Maharash, because it was it was the Friedrich Rebbe's grandfather, and he had and this was during his lifetime, 1947. The Rebbe printed there, he got it from Shver probably, a note from the Tzemach Tzedek which says, open your mouth and let it shine. And he wrote that very shortly before he passed away. So Hasidim understood that was a special tzavah to him that he should be successor. Again, is that argumentative? Absolutely. You can argue with that. But we have such a zettel, and it was before the passing of the Tzemach Tzedek. And he said, it was the language, Psach Picha, V'yoyer Tarasecha, whatever the exact language is not just, open up and talk. It's like, you're talking with divine affluence. You know what I'm saying? It's like, meaning you're the Rebbe. So what we had at the time is a Lubavitcher Rebbe, Reb Shmuel, in Lubavitch, with a small group of Hasidim, and then we had the grandson of Tzemach Tzedek that you mentioned, Hillel, Reb Shlomo Zalman of Kapust, in Kapust, with the majority of Chabad Hasidim. The majority went there, even though he was younger. I believe he was younger than the Maharash, not by much, but he was younger. So what?
Is there any shalshelas from Kapust?
Today, the answer is no. There is someone in Baltimore, I think maybe you know who it is, I forget the name, who comes from Kappas Chasidim, and he has somehow access to Maimorim that the Kappas Rebbe wrote, and he's been putting it online. I haven't seen him in a while. I would imagine...
Noah Shavrik.
Noah Shavrik, right.
Yeah.
But
I learned... I was exposed learning with him to what Kappas.
Okay, but again, even if he's an active Kappas to Chassid, there's no Kappas to Shul left. There's basically in 1923, the last grandson of the Kappas to Rabbi Yehuda Leib passed away. His name was Rabbi Shmaryo Noach of Babroisk. Rabbi Shmaryo Noach Schneerson. There's a picture of him. He passed away in Pei Gimel. And that was kind of the end of the Kappister dynasty. Now there was a shul in Manchester that was still, there was a little bit here and there, but as the years went on, it all, the Rebbe said in the 50s and 60s, it's time, because they were still fighting out there in Manchester, right? He said, what are you fighting for? The previous Rebbe was left, and most people came Lubavitch Chassidim, so like, cut it out already, okay? It was a part of history, it's finished, let's go on. So my answer to you, Hillel, would be no. Are there people that come from Kappas Chassidim? Absolutely. In fact, Rabbi Oltein here, our mashpia, has nudged me many times. I should gather as many names as I can who were Kappaster, and but that's a hard job. But the answer is there are, just like Shavrik and others. But I want to conclude just with one thing. So, how is it that the Maharash, who was the youngest, and he had the smallest crowd from all the sons, okay, not just from the Kappaster, I think from the other 3, 4, the Nyezhner and the Ladir, he had, it's because really of a few families. One is Althaus. I don't know if you have you have in Israel, Althaus. There were a few people who stuck, and Schneerson, the Rebbe's family, and the Yanovskis, Rebbe Tzanchana. They fire and brimstone. They put up with a lot, and they stayed with the program. And I would credit the Rashab, the son of the Maharash, for the continuation of Lubavitch, because he made the yeshiva. That yeshiva that he made in 1896 in Lubavitch Yeshiva, created soldiers. They started to learn Chassidus deeply, not just cursory, and it brought back this. The previous Rebbe writes that in 1891 Chassidim started to come back to Lubavitch. There were such words in a letter of the Frierdiker Rebbe, and I asked them, Chassidim, thinking that this means that the Kappaster started to come back, and they told me yes. Although the Kappaster passed away in 1899, Reb Shlomo Zalman, but it seems like there was a starting to come back. So the way I see it is from 1866, or maybe 1861, till the yeshiva, that's like 30 plus years, there was a lull in Lubavitch, where Lubavitch wasn't the strongest. And the Rebbe Rashab, by making the yeshiva in 1896, he brought it back. There was a yeshiva in Babroisk, but they learned mostly Gemara. The Rashab, as we learned, the Kontrasumayim, the Chassidus, Baruch Ayim Beis and Samach Vov, he and Avodas Atfila and Farbrengens. You didn't have that. You didn't have, Farbrengens in Babroisk or in Kapust. I want to make it clear. It's not that they were big Chassidim. Don't get me wrong. There were big Chassidim. In each these were Chabad Chassidim, real Chassidim. But the formality that the yeshiva brought, every Rosh Chodesh, for example, in Lubavitch, every Rosh Chodesh they fabrained. That regulation was so healthy for developing a structure to a Chassidus. So let's say in Kapust, one Rosh Chodesh, if there was a Chassidus shul and he took out some mashke and there was some chevra, they sat down. But it's not like the mashpia comes, the bacharim come, and this is part of the program, and you have to come to the Farbrengen. It's not like you can or not. Part of the yeshiva curriculum is to come to the Farbrengen. The Rashab is credited with all this. So the Rashab, in a sense, re-cemented his father, the Maharash, in the analog of Chabad, history. Number 2 is that the Rebbe Maharash, because he was so unknown, I heard once from a big chassid, a big Talmud Chacham, like he was the most, that's why I started this Farbrengen, he was the most not understood. He was a craftsman. That in the Rebbe's room, there's a table that it's online, you can see that he built, but he built it of parts. So one of his grandchildren brought it over to France, and from France he sent it over to the Rebbe, and it's today in the Rebbe's room in Crown Heights. That's a table that the Rebbe Maharash built. So here you have someone who's very good with his hands. Yes, Moshe.
He's also a sofer.
He was a sofer. and he was a pharmacist. I think he knew, pharmaceutical medicines, Velvel. So
Pharmacology.
what? Yeah. So what I'm saying is, and one more important thing. Why did Chassidim like him? Because he was more social. His older brother, the Maril, the father of the Kopister, right? Very serious, very holy, but very serious. I give you a dogma. I've said this to Moshe many times. You look at your Rav of Kodesh Yiro, Rebbe Shapiro, because he's such a social person, he attracts people. You have other Rabbanim, maybe they know more Torah than him, but they don't have such a, in shuls, in Hasidison, there's this very important social part. For understandably, one has to be, holy and ruchnius and but the social component, we don't like talking about this, but if you think about it, the social component is very, very important. The Rebbe Maharash, because of his knowledge in carpentry, in medicine, in safros, and he had this easygoingness up to him, he drew the people to Lubavitch. And when it came time to elect a Rebbe in Lubavitch after the passing of the Tzemach Tzedek, the commoners wanted the Maharash. And what did they do? And they knew that the older brother, I told you this in the past, that the older brother, the Kopister, is jockeying for the position, right? But they knew they wouldn't have business. There would be less people coming to the train station. The wagoneers wouldn't bring people in. There wouldn't be a need for Hachnosas Archim, which they paid for, room and board, and on and on. So they wouldn't make a dime. So what did they do? They wrote a pashkvil, these notes speaking against the Kopister. It seemed like it came from the Lubavitch Chassidim. It didn't. It came from the commoners who weren't Chassidim in Lubavitch. That's what happened. So, but unfortunately, it caused a big rift. You're writing against us. You're talking against us. So we see clearly that the Maharash's character was a very important piece in the puzzle of cementing this Lubavitch to remain. And again, we would have to do a real serious study, which no one has done, and I don't think anyone probably can do it. But to compare the social aspect of these all sons and their Hasidim with the Maharash, you know what I'm saying? It would be a very interesting study. But at least what we do know a little is what I just told you, the difference between the Maharash and the Maril, and that is why the commoners in the city of Lubavitch wanted him. So this I see as a way that continued, and although they were smaller in numbers than the Kopister, and the Kopister had an entire Melucha, right? But Lubavitch continued. So I credit both the son, the Rasha primarily, and the Maharash because of his personality to this thing. And finally, the Rebbe always quoted the Nigan Lechatchila Rebbe. If the world says if you can't go under, you go over. And I say Lechatchila to begin with, you go over. Like in English would be over the top. Now, I told you once that this is found in one letter of the Frierdiker Rebbe. In one letter. And our Rebbe made of this the Sisma, the logo, the marketing line in marketing. This is the Coca-Cola, whatever the Lechatchila Rebbe. And because the Rebbe was that type of a person. But he sees in the Rebbe Maharash, which is his father-in-law's grandfather, this approach. How did he see it? Because the Rebbe Maharash would go to Paris, unannounced, park himself in the best hotel, be on the floor that's next to the bar, and he went in and saved someone who was a Yid, and Nebuch was far away. It's such like Baal Shem Tov, like the Rebbe once said, that the Rebbe Maharash conducted himself in a Baal Shem Tov like way, very unusual. That you wouldn't find a Rebbe, imagine in Yerushalayim and Nachla Shiva where they have the bars. No one's going there. Who went there? Rabbi Grossman. You have one Rabbi Grossman, right? I don't care. No Sephardi, no Ashkenaz. No one's going to bars, with girls and boys and smoking and drugs. Just Grossman did it. He saved Jews, right? Well, the Rebbe Maharash, so that's very unusual. We call it Baal Shem Tov. The Rebbe Maharash was in a similar way he did that. Another thing people don't know, it's good to know, Chevra, that he davened very early. I relate to it. He davened very early. And by 8:30 he was finished. In other words, Lubavitch Chassidim would daven. They would get up, they would go to the mikveh, they would learn Chassidus and daven. They finished 9, 10 o'clock. Right? I'm talking about daily, during the week. It says that he finished it very early, which is also interesting. Kind of, it's not the usual for Lubavitcher Rebbe or Lubavitcher Chassid to daven that early, right? So these type of hanhagas, customs and practices that he displayed through his lifetime, made him, on one hand, not understood. Hey, just like Rabbi Grossman, I'll use him as an example. What are you, with your full garb, with your hat and your beard and going into a bar? What are you, cuckoo? Like, come on. What are you going there with the closed eyes? You're going to trip over a girl, or you're going to trip over a table, So these type of things, it shows at the end of the day what kind of tzaddik he was. He did it to save a neshama. He didn't go there because he needed a good drink, and he didn't want to drink in Russia because people will know he's going into a tavern, a bar. So he went to a place in Paris. I mean, it's ridiculous. He went there to save a neshama, but outwardly it doesn't look good. It doesn't sound good. So these type of things only made him ultimately, in the eyes of Chassidim, more revered. The famous story with which a Rebbe, I forget which Rebbe, they said, we want you to be a Rebbe. He says, I'm not shaykh to be a Rebbe, leave me alone. What Rebbe? I can't read. I can barely read the Aleph Beis. So they say you're a liar, and they say, he says, I'm going to go away and run away. And because he shunned the rabbinate, the Rebistava, that only drew people more to him. And I would say that there's something there also to the Rebbe Maharash, because he looked more simple on the outside. So when they discovered that he is a tzaddik, and a big tzaddik, and he is a son of the Tzemach Tzedek, and he has a pedigree, and he does say chassidus, he said a lot of chassidus. We have entire sfarim of his. Shmuel's not here, but Shmuel loves, not only because his name is Shmuel, after also the Rebbe Maharash, but he learns the Rebbe Maharash's sfarim, So today's is Yom Haledus, is Tiferes shb'Tiferes. So first of all, it's a great day to ask Hashem through the Rebbe Maharash to bring bracha for us in Eretz Yisrael, for all the soldiers. Those the Chatufim should be returned, and should be peace and safety. And in our personal lives, it's the Rebbe, the Hayom Yom. You read the Hayom Yom. What's the wonder? He was born on Tiferes shb'Tiferes, on beauty within beauty. So that's why I thought today we'd verbring, and instead of learning the Tanya, let's chus for the Rebbe Maharash, and we'll all get together. It's Hashem tomorrow. Seid gesund. Psudas Toivus. Take care. Bye bye. Yeah.
Guys, do not drive anywhere. All the streets, the roads leading out of Beit Shemesh are closed.